All right. Good morning, everyone. Wow. That's all I have to say. You guys are amazing and talented, and what a beautiful, kind of got me choked up. Really just beautiful music, so thank you. So I appreciate the invitation to join C3 and your community this morning. My name is Melissa Baker-Boosamra. I'm a native of Grand Haven. I grew up here just a couple blocks away. I performed as a young thespian with the Central Park Players and the theater down the hall. And yeah, I just appreciate seeing friendly and familiar faces who are all a part of my my formative years, and I appreciate having you still with me here today. So I appreciate the introduction. Just a little bit about my background and the work that I do. I currently work at Grand Valley. I've got that really ridiculously long title, and you throw that on top of my hyphenated last name, and it's just too much. So we'll just stick with Melissa for now. The work I do at Grand Valley has everything to do with helping our students understand what it means to be engaged, informed, active citizens. So it's really exciting work. I think now more than ever, really important work as we think about the state of our world, the state of our democracy, and as we think about our place within all of that. I do have beautiful kids who aren't here with me today, but they're here in spirit. Thanks to my family for being here. I also carry with me, and I'll share a little bit about this with you here shortly, a number of experiences in my adult life, particularly with the Latino community. Hi, Gordy. I didn't even see you here. With the Latino community, both in West Michigan, but also in Latin America, that have really informed who I am and how I understand the world. So I also really appreciate the very clear and central place that your community has made to recognize what's going on in the world around us today. I mentioned in our 9 o'clock session that I didn't sleep really well last night, and part of that was probably just, jitters. But also, part of that was just thinking about the gravity of what we're seeing globally, and even more recently what we're seeing in Charlottesville. It's scary. It's disturbing on many levels. And so as I come to you here today, I had a message, some thoughts prepared that weren't specifically geared toward that particular current event, but I want to challenge all of us to think together today about how some of the reflections that I'll share with you apply. So I want to start by saying I've been thinking lately about this idea of a values-driven life. I'm part of this. I have the privilege to be a part of this leadership program in the city of Grand Rapids. I get together with a group of women from various sectors once every couple of weeks over the course of the summer. And we're in the process of writing our mission statements, our own personal mission statements, which I realize it's like you take this stuff for granted, right? Who you are, what you believe. And so it's been a good opportunity, both that program and our time here today, to really think and attempt to clearly articulate who I am and why I believe and do what I do. So I want to draw on Parker Palmer. He writes about the idea of vocation, and one of the essays that he's written is called Now I Become Myself. And so as I've been thinking about who I am, why I do what I do, and the message that I hope to bring to you here today, I wanted to think about my values. So Parker Palmer describes vocation not as a goal to be achieved, but as a gift to be received. And this really implies the idea that we have a sense of who we are in the beginning of our lives. So I've been thinking about who I was as a little girl, and maybe some of you here today can reflect back to me who I was. But when I think about it, I think about a couple of kind of primary characteristics. I know that I was someone who sought to understand. So I remember just really clearly recognizing what looked to me like the homogeneity of this community. I remember just noticing as a kid, like a 7-year-old, like, why is everybody white? I remember really seeing the distinction of communities when my dad would take me to Grand Haven versus Muskegon Heights basketball game. And I also remember just kind of being peripherally aware of some of the comments that I might hear at some of those basketball games, and feeling really disturbed and embarrassed and hurt by some of what just some of that, the rub between those communities, or the perceived rub. So I always wanted to understand why. Well, why is it that everyone around here looks like me? And what's the rest of the world out there look like? So I think about how that kind of seeking understanding for me in my adult life has translated into the value of education and how important education is to who I am. I also think about, as a young person, how important a sense of belonging and community was. I always wanted to be a part of something bigger than myself. And I carry that with me today. I remember thinking back about the 60s and how I thought, there was this struggle that I just wanted to be a part of that something bigger than myself. I was drawn to that sense of purpose and identity, and particularly around issues of justice, which is the third value that I've been thinking about. So the second would be this idea of community as a central value that I carry within myself and into my work. So the third value is justice. And when I think back to being a kid, I can remember, again, thinking about that distinction and the recognition of the whiteness of our community. I just knew that there's something not right about that. And so as I grew and had the opportunity to see a bit more of the world, I realized that that was true. There's a lot that's not right about the world around me. And so I just always had this sense of wanting to make things right for everyone. So I've begun to realize how these three values of education, community, and justice are really core parts of who I am. And one of the challenges for me in articulating what I'll talk with you about today is how those three things connect to the sense of the sacred. And I'll tell you, Katie Gordon visited with you earlier this summer. She's a dear friend of mine. I was texting with her a couple of days ago as I was trying to put my presentation together, and I told her the title. I'm like, Katie, what in the world? Liberal education, democratic engagement, and a sense of the sacred. What am I doing? Like, how am I going to pull these things together? And she texted back and kind of laughed, and she said, it's sometimes the hardest thing to pull together things that we just know are inherently connected. So bear with me as I attempt to weave the threads together. And just, I do want to say, the weaving there is symbolic of my attempt to weave these threads, and it's also a recognition of the importance that the lessons I've learned in the Latino community and in Latin America have kind of had in my life. So I'm going to start back to our reading from this morning. I want to just really quickly, there were some passages, for the sake of time, I assume, that were left out. I'm going to put them back in. Sorry, Leslie. Because I think they're important. So the poem was written by Eduardo Galeano. He is an Uruguayan poet, activist, and he's written a number of works. His most famous is probably Open Veins Latin America. That is a book that tells the history of U.S. and European conquest, pillage, exploitation of Latin America throughout the centuries. So really quickly, I want to go back to this idea of los nadies. Any Spanish speakers in the house want to help me translate? What does los nadies mean? The nobodies. Okay, so I want to start with this idea of the nobodies. And back to Galeano. He goes on to talk about the nadies, los nadies and the nobodies. He says, los nadies are those who are not, but could be, who don't have religions but superstitions, who don't create art but handicrafts, who don't have culture but folklore, who are not human beings but human resources, who do not have faces but arms, who do not have names but numbers. I am going to get choked up here today. Who do not appear in the history of the world but in the police blotter of the local paper, the nobodies who are not worth the bullet that kills them. So I wanted to share with you a couple of experiences that I've had in my life that have allowed me to see Los Nadies. And so I'm going to share a couple of short stories with you. So let's see, I'm going to see if we're going in order here. I'm going to start with the photo second from the left. So that is a photo that I took in Managua, Nicaragua. I was probably 20 years old, and I was there studying free trade and human rights, thanks to Barry Castro, who sent me on my way. And at that time, I had the opportunity to kind of ride alongside of some folks who worked with an NGO in the Managua City dump. Okay, so that's what you see there. That's the dump. And if you look closely, you can see, and I know it's far away from you guys, so maybe you can't, but there are a bunch of figures, kind of dark spots. Those are people. Okay, so here I am, 20 years old. I'm in the back of a pickup truck with a couple of other young people who are on this delegation to learn more about the impact of the U.S. on Nicaragua and on the developing world more broadly. And as I'm, riding through the dump, taking this all in, it stinks, as you can imagine. There are vultures circling overhead. It's 90 plus degrees out. There are people wandering through the dump. There was a young woman who, I don't even know how or why, but there she was. There was a young woman who was barefoot, bare-breasted, nursing an infant. And I saw her and our eyes met. So I've carried that with me, and I still do. This is embarrassing, you guys. So that's one story. Another one, as a young woman, this is the prison. As a young woman here in this community, I befriended a young man who made some bad choices, put in a very difficult situation. He was the son of Princeton-educated pastors, an African-American young man, and he got caught up with the wrong people at the wrong time, thank you, and found himself as an 18-year-old in prison. I'm not here to talk about that particular case. I'm not here to talk about guilt or innocence. I'm here to recognize what I saw as someone who watched the trial, who went to visit in the prison, and who just recognized up close and personally, again, the disparity that I saw. So when I would walk in, and I went to visit for several years, when I walked in the room, 95% of the faces were brown and black. So I again, filtering that into these bigger questions around why and these questions of justice. So that was a really formative experience for me, and a place where, again, I saw los nadies, the people who didn't matter, who were thrown away. This picture here, that's me about maybe 15 pounds lighter and, 15 years ago. I had the privilege of taking Grand Valley students on a trip to Guatemala back in 2007. And at that time, the purpose of this trip was for us to think about the impact of the U.S. on this particular country. So we learned about the history of Guatemala. We learned about the history of the U.S. military in Guatemala. We learned about the overthrow of the democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz in the 1950s. And we learned about the ensuing half century of civil war that took place, long, complicated history, but lots of U.S. involvement. And we also learned about the responsibility of the U.S. military in training forces who carried out genocide in that country and who murdered with impunity people who were los compañeros, the indigenous throughout Guatemala. So we actually went to sites of massacres and we heard the stories from the mothers of los desaparecidos, those who had been disappeared by the government. And this was all in the guise of fighting communism. The School of the Americas, I don't know if many of you are familiar, is a U.S. Formerly located in Fort Benning, Georgia, U.S. military-sponsored training facility for, as it turns out, Central American dictators and military forces. So we were complicit, right? We might not have known it, but we were complicit. So that picture is a picture of, and this is one hallway in a much larger building. And this is one building. We went to go visit with some forensic anthropologists. These are boxes of unidentified human remains. So you'll see that there are numbers listed. So we walked through the halls of these boxes of people's bones who had been murdered at the hands of the Guatemalan military trained by the U.S. So that's another example of los nadies, right? And being able to see them. Another example, I've had the great honor and privilege of spending time in the migrant farm worker camps here in West Michigan, teaching English. And so have had the opportunity to just hear some stories from folks who travel the country looking for work, working in very challenging conditions for very low wages, and who go unseen and unprotected. I've seen children sleeping under benches. I have seen, again, these temporary homes of men and women who work in the fields. I've heard the stories of mothers who are afraid to take their kids to school because they're afraid of getting picked up by ICE. I've known the trauma and heard of the trauma and exploitation of women who've been raped and that feeling of disposability. So these are all stories of los nadies. So I want to just challenge you to just sit with some of those stories and to ask yourself, can you see los nadies? Can you see the nobodies? So as this young woman who sought and still seeks understanding, I came to a time in my life when I was trying to figure it out. I mean, I'm still trying to figure it out. So I want to talk with you a little bit about this idea of liberal education as an attempt to help me understand the world around me and my place in it, my responsibility to those around me and to the world around me. So the best place to start in defining this idea of liberal education is with the Latin roots. Gordy, I'm going to call on you. I'm just totally kidding. Gordy teaches in the Lib Studies department at Grand Valley, and I'm sure he's probably done this a few times with his students. So again, those of you who have some kind of understanding or, didn't mean to do that, knowledge of Latin or Spanish will know that the root of the word liberal, anybody got any guesses? Liber, freedom, okay? Is everyone okay with this view? I didn't mean to mess it up. You get the idea. So liberal is derived from the Latin adjective liber, which means freedom. Education, the Latin root is educare, which means to bring forth. So this idea of a liberal education, we have to tell our students all the time, this is not indoctrination to a particular political frame. This is about teaching students to think so that they can be free. Thank you. It's about teaching students so that they can grow and become most fully themselves. Liberal education at its core, really, I think we can boil it down to two main components. So one of those is this idea of an exposure to the great thinkers across time and place who are trying to make sense of our place as humans in the world. So it's the content and the ideas. The other, I think, fundamental piece of liberal education is the set of skills that come along with becoming an educated person, including critical thinking, self-reflection, the ability to dialogue. So it's about, as Socrates would say, knowing thyself, really being able to reflect on who you are, why you believe what you do, and also being able to be in dialogue with others who are different. So I do want to share a little bit. Another mentor of mine and dear friend, Stephen Rao, who I'm sure some of you may know as well, has recently, he writes prolifically, and recently wrote a piece on the connection between liberal education and democracy. His article is titled Liberal Education, Cornerstone of Democracy. So in that article, he lays out the characteristics that you see on the screen that both lie at the heart of democracy as well as at the heart of liberal education. So, in an attempt to describe what liberal education is and to think about the connection between that kind of education and our democratic system, let's just read through those. So, he talks about mutual engagement in relation to the issues of common or public life, so that people are thinking about issues that are relevant to the public and are engaged in them. Pursuit of an ability to state one's own position and at the same time to be open to the positions of others, so knowing thyself and being open to learning from others. An openness to new or expanded truth that emerges from the dialogical encounter, so this idea that I'm always going to be learning and I'm open to that and I welcome that. A community in which diversity and unity are mutually enhancing. So I love the puzzle metaphor from this morning. This idea that diversity makes us stronger in our unity. And then again, this kind of bend toward continuous learning and growth. So I share this kind of brief overview of what liberal education looks like with all of you in order to go back to my question. So who are those Nadies and why do they exist? So through reading, self-reflection, dialogue, I keep trying to get to the bottom of that. And one of the stories that I read as a young college student was Ursula Le Guin's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Is anyone familiar with that story? Okay, it is the shortest story. Everyone should go and Google it. It's really, it's like 3 pages long. But the premise of the story is pretty simple. There is a town called Omelas, and this town is perfect. It's picturesque. It's located by the dazzling sea. The people who live there are strong and smart and secure. There is wealth. There is plenty. People are happy. It's the perfect place. So as Le Guin goes on to describe Omelas, she stops after describing this incredible, picturesque, utopian place, and she asks her reader a question. She says, "Do you believe it? Do you believe that Omelas exists?" Rhetorically, of course. And then goes on to say, "Okay, well, I've got one more thing to share. Let me share this with you before you decide." So she goes on to talk about the agreement that this town of Omelas has made in order to maintain its beauty and its perfection. And the agreement is that there's one small child that lives in a basement. Everyone in the town of Omelas knows that this child lives there. And the child lives in horrible, decrepit circumstances. As those in Omelas grow old enough, every young person is taken to see this child and told, "Your happiness Your security, your abundance is only possible if we keep this child in the conditions that it is in. In the story, they don't even give the child a name or a gender. And so the reader is challenged along with those kind of townspeople in Omelas to think about that agreement and whether or not we would be comfortable being complicit in that kind of an agreement. So the story of Omelas is really meant to prompt us to think about our own complicitness and the need that we, maybe an unacknowledged need, have to have los nadies exist, to have that child exist that allows us to prosper. So when I switch back to the picture of los nadies, each one of these groups of people, their existence in some way benefits the status quo, in some way benefits those of us with privilege. So I suggest that you go find the ones who walk away from Omelas and think about that question. What would you do if you found out that the prosperity of your community only existed on the backs of others? What would you do? In the story, there are some who walk away. And in reading that with students, we're always kind of left with the question, well, where'd they go? And, what's the kid's still there? So I don't know that walking away is the right answer. And I don't think that Le Guin poses a right answer as much as she wants us to think about that question. So again, thinking about los nadies and why they exist. So again, leaning on the privilege that I've had to read and to think and to learn and write, I've done some digging to try to understand why los nadies exist. And this is the kind of more theoretical part of this talk. One of my sisters was in the 9 o'clock session and she said, it's so complicated. She said, I just want to love people. So just bear with me for a minute while I attempt to draw up a theoretical frame around this question of why los nadies exist. And then we'll get back to the simple stuff of how do we better love each other and los nadies. So Rebecca Martusewicz, Gordy, you should be up here with me. Gordy, as you can tell by now, is a colleague and friend, but he introduced me to Rebecca Martusewicz and Chet Bowers, both of whom have thought deeply about kind of the cultural foundations of our ecological crisis, as well as the existence of los nadies, maybe not in those terms, but the idea of injustice environmentally and with regard to the way that we exploit human beings. So Rebecca Martusewicz has coined this term eco-justice, and she uses an eco-justice framework to identify what she calls the cultural metaphors which contribute to our worldview, how we understand the world. This is the stuff that we don't even see. The way we talk about a worldview to our students is it's the glasses that you put on. You don't even know you've got them on, but it's the lenses through which you see the world. And it's not until you take them off that you realize that they're there. So Rebecca Martusewicz identifies a number of modern discourses or root metaphors that kind of shape the way that we in the West see the world. So those include, as you can see, individualism, commodification and consumerism, anthropocentrism, androcentrism, and ethnocentrism. Like my sister said, complicated. But, let's just break it down. So the idea of individualism is central to our American narrative, right? We are a highly individualistic culture. We're separate, we're unique. The idea is the focus on individual rights as opposed to kind of focus on the common good. And American meritocracy, this idea that if you succeed, it's because you've worked hard for it, you've pulled up your bootstraps, is based on this idea of individualism. So this idea of individualism is counter to a number of other narratives that we find in the developing world. For example, I think Rolando Tompkins Jones, another great friend, talked a little bit about Ubuntu when he was here. And that is the kind of African humanist idea that I exist because you are. So it's really quite the opposite of individualism. Commodification and consumerism is this idea that everything has a value, and not an inherent intrinsic value, but a price tag. So we in the West, in particular in the United States, this idea that land becomes property, water is a commodity, ideas become a commodity, everything has a price tag, can be purchased, and that the idea is that happiness is found in the accumulation of wealth. Okay, so anthropocentrism, you guys know this term? Humans at the center. So the kind of story that I think illustrates this most centrally in terms of our cultural narrative is the story of Genesis, right? Where man is given dominion over all of the animals and creatures, and the world is ours as human beings. So it's the lack of recognition and value placed on the broader natural world, and the real focus on human centrist or human centered value. Androcentrism is the idea of male dominance. So it's this cultural tendency to define women as less capable. Again, back to the Christian narrative, women being taken out of the rib of Adam. So women as secondary. And ethnocentrism, which again, this morning, I think is a really important time for us to dig more deeply into this idea. This is the idea of putting some groups, i.e. white Americans, in the center, that whiteness is what is normal, that whiteness is what is superior, and the very concept of race was really constructed, and I'm sure I'm, preaching to the choir here, as a tool to divide people who were of the same class, right? So race was really created as a tool to maintain the wealth of slave owners during the time of slavery. So ethnocentrism is this idea of putting white at the center and at the highest point of the value hierarchy. So I share that with you. Do those lenses feel pretty familiar? Got your glasses on? Okay. I think it's important to recognize it doesn't have to. We can wear different glasses, okay? And that's what we do with our students when we think about the world we live in. How do we see the world and why? But how might we see the world differently? Oh gosh, I almost don't even want to go there. How much time do we have? Are we over? Okay. So this is definitely a very important frame for another set of glasses that, if I was wearing them, I'd probably be wearing both the cultural metaphors and then the neoliberal economic paradigm over the top. Maybe I'd have like bifocals on or something. But there really are two sets of lenses that inform the way that we live and the way we understand the world here in the West, and in particular in the United States today. And the idea of neoliberal economics centralizes or centers the idea of the market as king. So competition is the defining characteristic of human nature. Citizens are consumers, as opposed to our value is as purchasing. Our value is in purchasing. Some kind of characteristics of neoliberal economic policy include eliminating regulation, environmental regulation, labor regulation. All public services should be privatized. So there's this emphasis on the market really being the determinant of good. And in my time in Latin America, it was very clear to me that the market does not always value people and the natural world in the way that people might choose to do. So all of this to say, both of these sets of lenses have helped me to begin to understand how it is that Los Nadies exist and why. And I would encourage you to use those lenses to answer that question. And I will say that my thinking is that we need them to exist, or we think that we do. That benefits to those with privilege come on the backs of those who don't share in that privilege. So those two sets of lenses help us to justify the existence of Los Nadies. So, how much time, Leslie? Okay, oh, perfect. Okay, so I could go on and on. I think I'd like to end with a question that I posed this morning, and there is certainly more that I'd like to talk about. But I think that this idea of how we use our privilege is a really important question to ask. So how many of you are familiar with the idea of privilege or white privilege? Okay, so I think that this is becoming a much more common frame for folks, and I think that's a very good thing. So privilege is, in terms of a definition, the set of unearned privileges, unearned benefits that we get simply by being born into the skin that we're born into. And privilege is often related to the color of our skin, literally, but it also is related to our gender, related to our class, to our sexual orientation, etc. And so, as someone who carries a degree of privilege as a white, educated, middle-class person, I have to think about what I'm going to do with that, and how my opportunities and my privilege can help to challenge the existence of Los Nadies. This is the simple answer, and I think it's a really deeply profound one. We need to think about who our neighbors are and challenge ourselves to see our neighbors beyond the person who lives next door, and including the person who lives next door. We need to think about, and I'm going to, go beyond the people who I saw in the dump and, the folks who were incarcerated in Muskegon Correctional Facility. I'm going to talk about those white nationalists. They're our neighbors. Okay? So we need to think about how we can see ourselves in our neighbors, who might not look like us, who might not think like us, and how are we going to love those people? Oops. I think important words from Dr. King about the willingness to stand by as injustice happens, right? The appalling silence of good people, taken from Letter from a Birmingham Jail. If you haven't read it, please do. And I won't go into all of this, but I do want to make sure we tie in the idea of democratic engagement. So that's the how, right? Once we kind of think about how and why Los Nadies exist, once we begin to be able to see ourselves in our neighbor and people who don't look like us, don't share our experience, we need to think about how we're going to love those neighbors. Sure, it's the simple things like walking next door and saying hello. It's the things that we do in our civic life, like volunteering. What we're doing at Grand Valley, and I think is, this idea of democratic engagement is really seeing a resurgence nationally, is thinking about how we can move beyond volunteerism, how we can move beyond philanthropy, and how we can move into really taking an active role as citizens around these bigger public issues. So I really think about democratic engagement, organizing, community organizing, getting out the vote, hosting forums about public issues so we can better understand them. I think about those kind of ways of being democratically engaged as a way of loving my neighbors in a very public and very active way. And so I just want to share those thoughts with all of you, and I apologize that I've kind of had to end somewhat abruptly. It's about using our heads to understand. It's about using our hearts to relate. And it's about using our hands to get involved and find a way to actively love all of our neighbors through democratic engagement. So there you go.